Justice is inevitable. And our responsibility, even if we have the smallest of means, is to resist oppression everywhere.
Salam everyone, welcome back to Popular Cradle. Today on the show, I'll be joined by Yara and Muhammad to talk about the Nakba. Obviously, we know there are different tellings of the Nakba. You know, there's the day that it's commemorated, of course, the date, May 15th, the day the State of Israel was created, and that's Nakba Day, of course. Nakba also is referred to as a period of years sometimes, 47 to 49 or 48 to 50, when, of course, this catastrophic process of displacement, ethnic cleansing was so acute. We all know, 800,000 Palestinians forcibly removed from their homes, displaced across the region and the world. And then now, though, especially over the past few years, I think there's also the idea of Nakba as an ongoing process. That is, the past 2 years, a new Nakba or an acute accelerated phase of Nakba. And that is certainly true and important. We said in our first episode, Palestinian history doesn't start with the Nakba. And we know, of course, that Nakba also didn't end. It's not something that ended. So for this episode, we have been thinking about what is Nakba, what are the gaps in common understandings of Nakba, and how does that all relate to a national struggle, the struggle for liberation through the constitution of a Palestinian nation. And what does that look like today after, more than 2 years of genocide?
Yeah, I think when we did our first episode, we talked about, like you said, history not starting with Nakba, but I think obviously, part of the reason why we say that is to talk about how Palestinians resisted Zionist settlement and British colonization. But I think the flip side is that the Nakba obviously is nonetheless a really critical event for the Palestinian people. It can help us make sense of the current condition of the Palestinian people today, whether we think about it as a singular process or an ongoing process. And, obviously, I think there's a huge case to be made for understanding it as an ongoing process. But nonetheless, I think especially for a lot of the Palestinians who, are scattered around the world today, right, fragmented as a people across various countries, from refugee camps to, major cities. You've got Palestinian populations that are in Latin America and, all across North America and across the Middle East and so on. And, we don't even know where Palestinians are. There is not even some kind of documentation of where all of the Palestinians are. And so much of that can be traced back to the way in which the Nakba as an event and as an ongoing event results in the displacement of the Palestinian people and their both physical fragmentation, but then as an outcome of that, political fragmentation, right? So really meaning that Palestinians don't have unity under a single physical or political body, but instead are a sort of displaced people that are scattered across multiple geographies and really are separated from one another in many ways, including families that have, that faced the period of Nakba in 1948 and found themselves scattered across multiple geographies, and some which never really saw each other again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the Nakba itself, it helps us to understand the context under which Palestinian national identity formed, the challenges that it faced, the things that it had to overcome in a very practical sense in trying to formulate as a national identity that's probably unique to the Palestinian experience, and it's unique because unlike the surrounding states, which were vying for independence from a far-reaching colonial authority, the Palestinian experience was one of confrontation with a colonial authority, but also confrontation with a settler colonial population that was intending on essentially destroying this nation in a very early form of its evolution as a nation. Mm-hmm. And I think the fragmentation exists on a visceral experiential level for Palestinians. So depending on where you were at a given moment over a few years, your life was altered for a very long time. And I think that is true of every Palestinian, whether that Palestinian remained in 48 Palestine and then had to contend with the years following that, or you were displaced or relocated multiple times for the next few years of your life, or you were someone who ended up remaining in the territories that were administered by Egypt or Jordan in the periods that followed. So like these different experiences and the complete destruction of Palestinian political order is the context for which the Palestinian national movement had to form itself. And to try to build unity, a political unity and a national unity, like an identity, a shared identity amongst all of these different people who just experienced this once in a generation trauma, I think is something that honestly should help us understand better today's experience in Gaza and, you know, not just Gaza, but obviously all of Palestine.
Yeah, Mohammed, I think what we've been thinking about for this episode is that the overcoming this fragmentation, building unity, that is the task right now, the struggle right now in 2026 after these couple of years of acute, intensified genocide in Gaza and this sort of like mass collective experience that's also a mass trauma, so much death, displacement, all of that. And so, you know, we started talking about this episode and thinking about this episode from the perspective of our own families and each of our families' experience with Nakba. And so, yeah, I wonder, Mohammed, if you want to tell us about your family's experience of Nakba.
Yeah, I think, you know, for one side of the family, they experienced the Nakba in a very different way, you know, because they were largely located in Al-Quds and Jerusalem, and they were from an urban background. Whereas my paternal grandmother, her experience, and my paternal grandfather, his experience, his family's experience, really, I think, embody the devastation of the Nakba. On my paternal grandmother's side, you know, her family, one side of her family was from Al-Quds and the other side was from Abu Ghosh, which is only a few miles away from Al-Quds. It's one of these like surrounding rural villages. And her parents married, and you know, there was always a sort of tug and pull that existed amongst Palestinians in that moment around whether you stay in the village or go live in the city. And this is a tension you probably see in movies and, you know, retellings of this period of time. And so for her, during the Nakba, obviously they were hearing about the massacres that were taking place. Abu Ghosh, specifically the village itself, wasn't the target of a systematic depopulation effort. But the people who lived in that village heard about Deir Yassin, which was also a few miles away, or heard about Lifta, which was also a few miles away from them. They heard the ethnic cleansing massacres that took place in those villages. And so my great-grandfather decided to relocate the family to Al-Quds because theoretically it was safer, especially for women and children. And on his way back to gather their belongings on the route from Al-Quds to Abu Ghosh, which is about 5 miles away, he was killed. And this was a devastating experience for her mother, his wife. And she had, I want to say, if I remember correctly, about 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons. The 2 sons were the youngest. And, you know, at this point in time, everything's collapsing around them. You know, in the years that followed, all of them were married off, all of the daughters, because the mother, she went into a state of depression. This is how it's retold to me. Like, this is how my grandmother talks about her own mother, that she was depressed, that she couldn't really take care of them in any real meaningful way, and that she couldn't afford to keep them. You know, my grandmother was 17 at the time. She was married to a man that she never met. She was sent off to Kuwait, which is my grandfather. And you know, she tells me the first year of her life, she cried every day. And that was her experience. That was her Nakba. You know, it wasn't necessarily, she doesn't retell it as, oh, I heard about this massacre. She tells about her father being killed and then her being married off. And that's her story, you know? And obviously, she never saw parts of her family again. Or, they happened to relocate and meet each other in the US, actually, some of them. So, this was her experience. And it not just shaped her life, but all of her sisters' lives and the sons. Like, I won't get into the details of sort of the long-term ramifications on their like individual psyches, but it was devastating. It was a destruction of a family in a moment, in a way that, we could only imagine what it would mean for a child to lose a father, but then because of that loss, then to lose your family. That was really her experience with the Nakba. And, my grandfather, her husband, also had a similar experience. He came from an actual like middle class family. I think that's how they would describe them today. And his father owned a coffee shop in what came to be termed West Jerusalem. And after West Jerusalem was essentially sacked by Zionist forces, he was displaced. And my grandfather, even though he was raised on some level middle class, he became a carpenter in Kuwait. And the dynamics of being a refugee in a Gulf country and the fear that came with, we are always in a precarious place, that really shaped his psyche even until he came to the US. It shaped his relationship with his sons, about what it means to have money or what it means to always feel like you are in a place temporarily or could become temporarily. Even after he lived in the US for decades, he felt like it was temporary because at some point in time, things could change and he would be forced to move out of it. And so anyways, those are the two, on my father's side, those are the stories I grew up with around sort of the consequence of the Nakba for them. Yeah.
Yeah, this thing about temporary, about now for the rest of their lives, they feel that wherever they are is temporary. That really resonates. My grandmother still talks like this. She's, like 95. So both of my paternal grandparents were born and grew up until their teenage years in Jaffa. My grandmother was born to a upper middle class family in Jaffa. My grandfather, sort of part of a urban poor class, working class in Jaffa, and both of them displaced before they knew each other. My grandfather in 1948 is maybe about 16 or 17. My grandmother was around 13. They didn't know each other yet. My family's Nakba story I know through my grandmother, because my grandfather passed when I was a baby. And my grandmother talks about, everything, even their reaction to Nakba, her family's reaction to the Nakba was also one of like imposing that all of this is temporary and we'll go back. We'll go back. We're about to go back. It's not going to be much longer. We're going to go back at every stage. She remembers in 48 that the fighting, she talks about like shooting all the time. And it just got really close. It kept on happening until finally her father, who owned like a concrete and tile business, very successful business in Jaffa. Her father was like, okay, girls, his daughters, they had 10 children. The daughters and the mother, my grandmother's mother, you guys go to Beirut for 2 weeks and then you'll come back. Everything will be fine in 2 weeks. So they went by boat from Jaffa to Lebanon. They were there actually for 3 or 4 months. And of course, they didn't ever go back. They couldn't ever go back. After some time in Beirut, those few months, they went to Syria. They were in Syria for like 6 years. And then eventually they went to Amman. And it's in Amman, in actually my grandmother's mid-20s, that she met my grandfather. She actually, for our people, she was a little bit older when she got married. But at every step, for example, they didn't enroll the children, the daughters, in school in Beirut, in Damascus, and in Amman, because it was always, we're going to go back. We're going to be able to go back. It's just another month. We don't need to settle here in a serious way, right? And so this like temporary, not only a feeling that like everything can be taken and everything is temporary and you can't rely on anything, but also that you're reacting by saying, yes, but this chaos is also temporary. We're going to go back. We're going to go back. And my grandmother, she's like 95 or something. She's in Amman as we speak, talking about going back. we're going to go back. It's something, just
How
talking
old
about
would
like,
she have been at the time of the Nakba?
like 13.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
she was born like in 35. Yeah. Yeah, and this is a woman who had 8 children in Amman, owns a house in Amman, raised her kids in Amman, and still says like, well, we're just going to go back. We'll go back, and of course, so many similarities, even though each family's story is unique, but so many similarities too, like never seeing some family members ever again, never knowing what happened to them, never hearing from them again, or by chance running into a family member that you didn't know if you were ever going to hear from them again, and you randomly run into them in a train station in Damascus. That chaos, that collective fragmentation that we're talking about, it's just so acute inside every single family.
Yeah, what's interesting is my grandmother's side of things. Her sisters, a few of them married into men from the Lifta village, which was also a few miles from Al-Quds. And so they're obviously familiar with it. And they all happened to, like one of them, the initial person, relocated to Dallas, Texas. Mm-hmm. And then all of them got pulled to Dallas, Texas. I mean, so much so there's a Lifta society in Dallas. And so it's like my grandmother's family also became sort of associated with an adjacent village, and a village that was like fully depopulated, mm-hmm. Completely ethnically cleansed in the case of Lifta. And so it's like all of her family, ironically enough, ended up in Dallas together, with the exception of one brother that remained in Al-Quds or made his way to Al-Quds. And then my dad's side of the family, like you're talking about Australia, Germany, Canada, like they're everywhere after starting out in the Gulf, moving between different Gulf states. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yara, what is your family story, I guess?
Yara has there's an interesting sort of like Lebanon, Palestine, back and forth maybe. Yeah.
So like on my Palestinian side, my Jiddo, the Shafani family, they're all from North Palestine. So from the Jalil, from the Galilee. And like they were scattered across like Malia, Fasuta, and then Safad. My Jiddo lived in a little village in North Safad called Abel el-Qameh, which was like basically like they were wheat farmers. I think the name like translates to wheat meadow or something like this. So like they were like farmers, peasants. And all of those villages in North Galilee, because they were like composed of a lot of peasantry, they played a really large role actually during the 1936 revolt. They were close to the border. The people who were living in those villages were actively engaged in the revolt because it was largely a peasant revolt. But basically the story that I know about my Jiddo is that his particular village was initially part of the French mandate. So like, because the French had colonized Lebanon and the British Palestine, right? And so his village, I mean, back then there wasn't really a differentiation between like the villages of North Palestine and South Lebanon, right? And so his village happened to be on the French mandate side, but the borders were renegotiated in like 1923 or something like this, and basically placed under the British mandate, which is interesting because all of the other Shafanis are in Palestinian villages, but technically had that sort of renegotiation not happened, my Jiddo wouldn't have actually faced Nakba. He would have been on the Lebanese side, right? Mm-hmm. They're called the 7 villages. So in 1948, my Jiddo, they fled. They were kicked out to Lebanon from that village. It was a really small population, probably just over 300 people at the time. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that there was any fighting that happened in 1948 in that village. It was more so the news of the massacres, that Safad had fallen to the Israelis and so on. And so the people of that village fled, and essentially they settled right on the border, right? Or that new border. And so when you guys are talking about like this idea of we'll go back, this idea of it being temporary, I mean, in the case of my grandfather, they literally set up tents right at that border in the Lebanese village of Deir Mimas in South Lebanon, where they could just see Palestine, right? They could see their village waiting essentially to be able to go back. Obviously, that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was the Zionist militias eventually attacked the Palestinians who were waiting in the bordering towns, pushed them more north. And so my grandfather met my grandmother in Deir Mimas. She's Lebanese from Deir Mimas. And because he was a Palestinian refugee, he had to live in the refugee camps in Lebanon. So the Palestinians had to live in the camps. And because she was Lebanese, but he's Palestinian, and so technically it goes to the side of the man. And so that meant that my grandmother, who's Lebanese, actually at the age of 16 left her home and moved into a Palestinian refugee camp with my grandfather and had 6 Palestinian children, and they lived their lives in a way as like my grandmother's effectively lived the life of a Palestinian refugee, right? They were displaced from one camp to the other. They lived through the war of the camps and the Lebanese Civil War. At some point, the camp that they were staying in Lebanon, which is a Christian camp called Camp Tbaye, it fell. The camp fell. It was seized by the phalangists, the Lebanese phalangists, and they were going to execute everyone who lived there or who was there. But actually the church got involved. I mean, my mom was there on that day. So part of my family had already fled the camp, but my mom was quite young and she was with my grandma and grandfather. And then they went to West Beirut, where the Palestinians and the side that was on the Palestinian Revolution was present. And so, yeah, I mean, when I think about my grandfather, he never really used to talk about the Nakba. The stories that I can gather are largely from my grandmother's retelling. My grandfather, I think it was like too painful of a experience for him. He was a man of very few words, but essentially like lived his life in Palestinian refugee camps. We eventually immigrated to Canada. My mother and I brought my grandparents to Canada. His kids were scattered across the world, as so many Palestinian families are. And yeah, he has family members who are in Syria, who are still in 48 Palestine. And yeah, I mean, there was always this idea that essentially like wherever you are is not really home, I think was the feeling that whether it was because of the literal experience of not being wanted or being a refugee population in a country, or just the fact this wasn't Palestine. So there was this always temporality of wanting to go back that never really, like my grandfather passed away over 10 years ago now. So yeah, so I think like the samud or like the interest in or the dedication to a right of return, I think is something that is really central to the Palestinian struggle, because even for those of us who've never been to Palestine, there's this determination to return. And I think that's passed from the way in which our grandparents saw this condition as a temporary condition.
Hamad, have you been to Palestine?
Have I been? Yeah, I visited because my mom's side of the family still lives there for the most part.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, they live in Al-Quds because they were from East Jerusalem. So, my mom was born in Jerusalem before it was occupied by the Israelis, or that part that was occupied by the Israelis. So yeah, even then, I recently found out, and just having a conversation, I recently found out, and my mom at the same time found out, that her mother during the Nakba was sent to Cyprus, and she lived on the Turkish side of Cyprus because my grandmother's actually half Turkish, because obviously the Ottoman Empire,
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, she lived in Cyprus for like 3 years and she hated it, is how she described it. And I honestly found this out like a year and a half ago. And my mom was shocked to find out that that was her mother's Nakba experience. She was sent away because at that time they were afraid that their daughters would be subject to various crimes. And so they didn't, they would send their daughters away. And her family happened to have a Turkish connection to the situation. So can you imagine what it means to try to reconstitute some sort of political body in this kind of chaos? It's one thing to be on the same piece of land in the same place. If you were to analogize it to like a meeting room, like where we can get together and figure out what we're going to do about the situation, versus where your entire population is thrown everywhere. And there was a Palestinian national consciousness, obviously, in the years preceding the Nakba. I mean, like the 1936 revolt is an example of this. And like this national identity is being built, not just naturally as a product of history, like these people spending all this time together and a shared economy and a shared culture and, a shared language, but also in reaction to colonial domination and Zionist settlement. You're watching something happen in your homeland, and your national identity is being constructed in relationship to that. Despite the fact that there were these divides that existed and characterized by class, a very early moment in Palestinian class history, like a working class is emerging inside of Palestine because of industry, especially at ports or whatever it might be. And then this peasant population, which has historically basically, been attached to this land. And you start to understand, actually, like just listening to you guys talk, is like Palestinian national identity formation in this period evolved in relationship to land, in part because of dispossession, but also because of attachment. It's like they are two sides of the same coin. I couldn't imagine, if we were to recreate the situation somewhere else where people didn't have an attachment to land but were displaced, would they form a national identity that centered return, for example? People have been displaced historically. This is something that happens in war. But the idea of return as being central to your national identity, or the need to reconstitute a national liberation movement in the diaspora or in exile in order to return, is something that would not have occurred in the absence of a really strong relationship to a social and cultural practice, right?
Yeah.
On this note of return, there's this quote by Fawaz Turki, where he's asked, what does it mean to exist as a Palestinian? And he says, I want to return, therefore I am. Which always stuck with me so much, because it just, I think, shows how return is such a central pillar of Palestinian national identity.
I'm thinking about this question of class conditions. What was, how was Palestinian society constituted across classes, at the time of the Nakba, and also how Nakba sort of even flattened those divisions or broke down, class stratification. It's my own family, I like I said, my grandfather, part of a, urban, poor, working class family in Jaffa at the time of the Nakba. My grandmother, sort of upper middle class family. But when they meet in Amman and get married, that class difference is not really there anymore, right? Because the Palestinian people as a collective have experienced this mass displacement, and what in some ways flattened those class divisions, and in some ways made the Palestinian people, part of one class, even though, of course, those class differences definitely endured and have an effect on the experience of different classes. But maybe you were a landowner in Palestine, but what does being a landowner of Palestinian land mean when your family has ended up living in a refugee camp?
What I was thinking about was, throughout the history of revolutionary theory, there was a lot of back and forths in at least the Marxist tradition around, whether or not you need a fully capitalist society to have a revolution, or whether you can have a revolution in more semi-feudal context. And the Palestinian experience actually proposed a third set of conditions from which you can try to launch a revolution. And it goes to your point, of one class, right? Everyone became a refugee. What does it mean to organize a revolution of refugees? And that was, I think, the Palestinian left, not to go on this tangent, but the Palestinian left's attempt at devising their own revolutionary theory revolved around, what does it mean to organize refugees in a revolutionary struggle, especially when working class or peasant became past identifiers as categories, no longer your present material relationship to economic structure, right? You're not literally working the land and thus creating this value for some landowner. You used to do that, or you no longer are a person working within a factory. You used to do that. And the other condition of being a capitalist, like you're saying, you are no longer a capitalist in the sense that you should be overthrown. But, I think like the earlier periods of the, before the Nakba was really this moment. And I think the 1936 revolt captures it most of what it meant for Palestinian class and peasant struggle to look like in the context of colonial domination. And actually, it intersected very nicely with both what it meant to struggle within your class as someone who is a victim of a capitalist or like exploited by a capitalist or exploited by a landowner, but also doing that in service of a national struggle against imperialism and colonial domination. So I think, Yara, like you were speaking earlier about your grandfather and being a wheat farmer, and I wonder if you can talk about that in the context of the 1936 revolt.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like class is so complicated in the context of a national liberation struggle. And I think it's actually one of the things, I mean, like you said, Mohammed, it's like this ongoing debate that exists amongst the left around national versus class struggle. And oftentimes it's not necessarily such an easy answer because there's ways in which national liberation is in and of itself a form of class struggle, and how nation and class are really intertwined in such cases. And I think that's why the 1936 revolts really like present such an interesting case study. Although honestly, there are others like, whether it's the First Intifada, the War of the Camps, right? Gaza, like there's various continuing ways that we can look at the question of class, displacement, dispossession in relationship to revolution in the Palestinian context. But I think in 1936 in particular, you sort of had there was definitely the formation of class structure that was taking place in Palestine, but it was really disrupted, I think, by the colonial process, right? And so like you had these Palestinian sort of elites, and I hesitate to call them a bourgeoisie because I don't know that, a claim like that can be made per se, although maybe that's something that we can debate. I feel like I'm not fully settled on this, but they were Palestinian elites, that like traditional elites, let's say. Some of them owned land, some of them were more urbanites, right? There was definitely like this urban rural kind of division that existed. And they were more educated. That it's oftentimes actually, when you look at histories of the Nakba or like pre-Nakba, it's oftentimes their history that's told because the peasantry was illiterate and didn't have access to being able to write and so on. But I think in a way you had this sort of disruption of a class formation. So like, whereas in, let's say like in England, right, you had the development of a capitalist class and a long period of dispossession of the peasantry and sort of the proletarianization of the peasantry, if you will, right, turning them into a working class force. In Palestine, you had this sort of division between the elites and the working class, or the rural and the peasantry, but you never really got the consolidation of a Palestinian bourgeoisie, in my opinion, nor did you really get the full proletarianization of the peasantry, because the British colonial or the British mandate wasn't trying really to transform the Palestinian peasantry into workers per se. They were bringing in a Jewish workforce, right? They were bringing in Zionist capitalists. And so in a way, you had a really interesting kind of, 1936 is interesting in that way because you see the way in which their tensions became prevalent between the rural and the urbanites, particularly during the first period of the revolt and like the strikes and so on. And, the peasantry was much more ready to take things into the direction of armed revolts. And there was even tensions between the peasantry and the working classes that were in the urban areas. So you had these kinds of like tensions between these sort of pre-class or semi-class formations. But the flip side is that even the Palestinian traditional elite, they were going to the British, trying to plead with the British to be partners with the British, right? And they were frustrated actually that the British was signing infrastructural development contracts and bringing in basically Jewish Zionist wealth and businesses and capitalists to Palestine because they wanted to be partners for the British. And the British never really saw them as partners, right? And so, you had this kind of, I think, on the one hand, I think class does make itself really clear in the 1936 period, where you see like the peasantry was much more ready to revolt and to resist. And they were also the ones who were losing access to their land at really, really high rates, and then being kicked into the city or to the slums and not finding work, right? Because companies were only interested in hiring Jewish labor. Actually, the Zionist labor movement like raised the slogan around Jewish labor. And so there was sort of this peasantry that was much more radical and willing to engage in revolt. So there is this way in which class presents itself. But the flip side is that ultimately the Palestinian people were facing dispossession at large rates. And there is a way in which class formation, at least during this period, is kind of disrupted. And I would argue it's not really consolidated probably until maybe the Oslo Accords period, although that's, I think, still a question of debate, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, that's why I think the Palestinian context is such a unique one for when the Nakba came and its consequences for, national identity formation. Like even the Palestinian left to try to formulate a project that's rooted in class or rooted in peasantry really struggled, in my opinion, to do so in a way that was, actually drawing out the practical aspects of the theories they were using. Like power didn't exist for them in the same way, but that's why ultimately, Mao and the experience of the Chinese Revolution was so important, even though, China was under occupation when a lot of that theory was formulated, but still had a territory from which to work and was still in a struggle against the right wing within its society. The Palestinian left never really had a context they can work with. And so it became about really national liberation as the primary vehicle for articulating what struggle would mean. So, I mean, maybe I want to shift gears a bit and just talk about Gaza within this context. I know that's a bit of a fast forward, but I really think the experience of the Nakba, the struggle of the Palestinian national movement to really rebuild itself with a population of refugees, successfully doing so, really enlisting them in struggle as a way to give them agency and enlisting them in what was a revolution, not a revolution in a traditional sense, but a revolution in the sense that their position within the world was transformed through their participation in direct struggle, both within Lebanon and Jordan, but also against imperialism and Zionism inside of Palestine. I think our moment is so different. And Yara, you bring up Oslo in terms of when we can start thinking about class formation as a consolidated process. I wonder how we can understand this moment, the experience of genocide as this last few years as producing another form of fragmentation that actually likely has created a rupture from the past experience. The Palestinian of today does not understand themselves in the same way as they did before October 2023, right? Especially the Palestinian in Gaza. And I think that's on the level of national identity. I think that's on the level of refugeehood as a fundamental identity. We can ask, has that transformed? It's necessarily transformed, but in what way? If the Nakba produced the subject of refugee, what did this genocide produce? And what does it mean to rebuild a national movement with that subject, especially across these different experiences where Gaza's experience was so uniquely fragmented and isolated from the rest of the Palestinian experience. And now we can look to the West Bank and say a similar process is happening, but in a radically different way, or the experience of the 48 Palestinian who's completely had to sort of remove their national identity from any sort of view, or us in the diaspora. So yeah, I want to engage that. Like, do we feel like there's more fragmentation than there was before, or how do we understand our moment of fragmentation?
Right. Yeah, I mean, because ultimately, like, the project of Zionism is really a project of erasing the Palestinians. I mean, I think this is what Hadi al-Shatara said in one of the last episodes, right? Like, that Zionism is a project of trying to do away with a Palestinian and a Palestinian identity. And I think so much of the Palestinian identity is based on, it's not just like a national identity in the sense, or a cultural identity, right? Like, it's also grounded in a shared political experience, right? A political experience of displacement, a shared interest in remaining on the land or returning to the land and liberating the land, right? And I think so much of the Zionist project has really been about fragmenting the Palestinian people, because if you're able to fragment a struggle, right, you're able to kind of turn it into 10 different struggles or 20 different struggles rather than a unified struggle, then it makes, you know, the victory of those people so much harder, right? And so the creation of divisions between the Palestinian people, it's obviously by design, the idea that the Palestinian diaspora is divided from the homeland, right? And I think Oslo sought to solidify that by ceding on the right of return, or that the Palestinians in Gaza face a specific kind of experience of blockade, and the Palestinians in the West Bank face a specific kind of experience of annexation, but also there's, you know, different kinds of rule and different regulations and how you can access one place or another. And obviously also the Palestinians living in 1948 Palestine facing a different kind of experience as well, right? And so I think this kind of fragmentation is designed to make the idea of a singular and united Palestinian revolution and Palestinian struggle, like, to shatter that, right? And in a way, like, I mean, actually, like, maybe this is a bit tangential, but just to kind of tie it to the prisoners movement a little bit, when we were working on the paper for Prisoners Day that the Palestinian Youth Movement and Writers Against the War in Gaza released in collaboration, there was a piece in that paper, the Prisoners' Day edition, which was a transcribed conversation between four people, four Palestinians belonging to different factions. And they transcribed this discussion in 2003 post-Oslo. They were having a conversation about the conditions of the prisons, the conditions of the Palestinian people post-Oslo. And when I was reading through it, it hit me that, you know, Walid Dakka was one of the prisoners that was in that, you know, conversation, and he's from 1948. But then you've got these other Palestinians who are from different parts of Palestine, and they're in a way kind of coming together potentially for the first time, like through the prisons, and able to have these kinds of discussion, which was sort of like a jarring thought at that moment, because I had been reflecting so much on the question of fragmentation, right? Like how much Zionism seeks to differentiate our experiences and turn us against one another, right? Alongside different geographic spaces. And reading that interview in a way made me think about how within the context of prisons, there's been this, like, sort of, in a way, unraveling of that in the place that's supposed to be the most designed to crush the Palestinian struggle. But I think the points that you name, Muhammad, around Gaza and like the experiences of Gaza in particular in the last 2 years, I think are very clearly things that the Palestinian people have to grapple with in terms of fragmentation, in terms of what kinds of plans exist for Gaza, and whether it's related to occupation or annexation and so on, and what that means for the role that Gaza has always played in terms of the Palestinian national liberation struggle.
I feel like with the prisons example, it's such a sort of like grounding example of what it looks like to overcome fragmentation in such a unique context of like the Palestinian struggle. It's unique from other national liberation struggles. You know, I think like these questions, Muhammad, that you posed about, you know, what is the national character of this struggle in a time of such acute fragmentation, what is the subject that has been created by, the past couple of years in Gaza. They can be so overwhelming, like to me, and obviously to all of us. It can be so overwhelming. But the prisons example, Yara, but so many other things, talking about the history that after the Nakba, still like a national character was created. And despite that mass displacement, that mass exile, at a time when it was so much harder than today to communicate, at a time when families were flung apart. And then, I think the prisons example, that the context put Palestinians together to interact in a way that they wouldn't have been able to, but for the prison, in this, like deeply ironic way. And then turning to myself and being, thousands of miles away in the far diaspora, born and raised, and thinking then about like, what is in my unique context, the way that I participate, the way that I identify as part of the Palestinian nation, and that overcoming fragmentation from here is also, like completely unique, but that it is about like this exercise of everybody's agency, like stepping in, like proactively engaging with other Palestinians, with other Arabs, to be organizing and building from where we are. Like this is what we can do in our unique context that has been like imposed on us by all of this fragmentation. What do we do to be part of a larger collective in which we all identify across these common experiences, right?
Like I actually have 2 points to make. I think like they're like, one is a reflection that I had that it's kind of sad in a way, or made me feel sad. And then the other is, I guess, like a saving grace in like listening to both of you speak about, fragmentation and what it looks like in this moment and stuff like that. The one thing, that I've sort of seen in the last few weeks are like the debates that have occurred around Lebanon and the Lebanese resistance's entry into the war, and the debates that you see they come up on Instagram, like between different Lebanese sects arguing and debating like different questions, like whether the resistance should remain armed, whether there should be quote unquote peace with Israel and stuff like that. And like, on the one hand, obviously there's like these horrible talking points that come out from those opposed to resistance that are largely about surrendering their country to the West and Israel and things like that, and that talk about building an Israeli embassy in Beirut or the Ashrafiyya or whatever. But there's also a part of the discourse on the side of the Lebanese who are opposed to Zionism's entry into Lebanese land that has become confined to whether or not there's an occupation in Lebanon. And it feels like this is like epitomizes the fragmentation of like Arab identity, right? Like that you have this resistance force that's concerned with Israeli occupation in Lebanon as the pretext for whether resistance should occur in Lebanon, without the sort of holding the main background context in mind that actually, like, Israel is occupying Arab land outside of Lebanon, like inside of Palestine. You know what I mean? That the resistance to this project does not end at the Lebanese border, or should not. That is the concept of Arabism as a political project. The fate of Arabs in Palestine is the fate of all Arabs, right? And so I'm just like, I was just thinking about it because Lebanon is one of the few remaining territories that there is a resistance that's rooted in solidarity with Palestinians, and not just on whether or not the Greater Israel Project is coming to you. You know what I mean? And I just worry about this politics of the Greater Israel Project is coming to you, and that's why you should care, as opposed to it's in Palestine. You know what I mean? Like it's just committed a genocide against your people, not against Palestinians. Like against your people. The Greater Israel Project hit you when it hit Palestine, not when it hit Lebanon or Syria, or when it could hit Iraq, or when it could hit Saudi, you know? And that's that reification of a fragmentation through different peace processes, through the Abraham Accords. And now it feels like it's reaching Lebanon in a way that the Lebanese resistance rejected on October 8th, like
Right.
purposefully and intentionally, and so I just worry about that sort of what feels like retreat. That's one. I understand there's a response to conditions in Lebanon. I don't want to make the Lebanese people of the South shoulder more than they need to shoulder. They're under a genocide themselves. But I just reflected on this. Yeah. The second thing I will say is like the problem of Zionism for Zionism is that it's an incomplete project. The conditions for unity are not whether or not we can develop a shared experience as Palestinians. I think we've shown ourselves capable of overcoming deep experiential fragmentation and geographic fragmentation to build some sort of unified political program towards a project. The conditions for unity is resistance, like a continuation of resistance. And unfortunately for Zionism, unfortunately for our struggle, so long as Zionism exists as a project that is hell-bent on, like you said, Yara, erasing the Palestinian national identity, there will be resistance. And that is the ground for unity. That is the ground for developing an actual national project or creating a subject, the subject, whether that is transforming the refugee into a fidai or the genocide victim into a resistance fighter once again, because ultimately I don't pretend to assume that that is the identity of people of Gaza as victims. They are also resisting their conditions right now. But the question is in what way? And the same we could say of where there is settler terror, there will eventually be met with an intifada. The petri dish of Palestinian unity is resistance, and that resistance is a necessary product of what our people will continue to face. Like, it is inevitable. And I know it's a cliche that's often thrown around that like, oh, if you want Palestinians to put down their guns, you got to give them peace or whatever. But actually, like, Zionism as a project is creating every day the conditions for another intifada or a revolution or some project of actual resistance that, is the precondition for unity. That is, like the saving grace, I guess you can say.
Yeah, Mohammed, I think there's like the silver lining, right? Or the bright side that you're bringing up around the fact that Palestinians have shown that, in every context, not just Palestinians, but people in the region have shown that in every context, they will find an ability to resist in the face of occupation and colonization. And I think in a way, like, even just to sort of connect it to some of the stories that we were, like the Nakba stories that the three of us were talking about earlier, but they're not just us. Like, every Palestinian I meet that's like a young person living in the far diaspora, who was born in the far diaspora, or like, spent most of their life outside of Palestine, maybe some never even went to Palestine, like, talks about return with a kind of like rigor and conviction. And we've seen in the last 2 years that these Palestinians not only talk about return, but also rose to the conditions of the last 2 years in the face of the genocide, and mobilized and organized and did everything possible to take up this issue. And it makes me think about this idea of the Palestinian condition of exile being a temporary condition. And I think what makes it a temporary condition is the Palestinian people's ability to pass from generation to generation this like conviction and determination to resist whatever conditions were met with in order to try to return. And I feel like that conviction is not disconnected from the Nakba stories that we grew up listening to. Like, I remember one time I was reading Ghassan Kanafani's wife, Annie Kanafani. She had written this like little 16-page booklet honoring Ghassan. And in it, there's a letter that his son wrote to him. And there's, photos of Ghassan. There's this amazing photo of him in China at the Great Wall, by the way. But anyways, it's like this really great little pamphlet of his life. And the last page is this quote from Annie Kanafani where she says, "When the Palestinian people return home, they will meet Ghassan in every flower, in every tree, they will feel him in the soil and the air of Palestine. Right. But Ghassan wasn't martyred in Palestine. Like, he was martyred in Lebanon. He's buried in Lebanon. But there's this idea that, like, when the Palestinian people return to Palestine, so too do the martyrs of Palestine. So too do our grandparents who were exiled. Right. And so I think, like, when I read that, it made me on a personal level think about my grandfather, right, who is, buried in a cemetery in Toronto, right, who never got a chance to go back to Palestine. And there's this idea that, like, my ability to return, or my children's ability to return, right, would actually mean, like, being reconnected with our grandparents or my grandfather. So I think there's a way in which the personal stories of Nakba, whether it be the Nakba of 1948 or stories of ongoing Nakba, actually light flames in the generations of Palestinians to come in order to fulfill the determination of return that our grandparents or that our parents felt, that made them feel like exile was temporary.
Okay, so I think that is it. It's a good place to stop. This is our Nakba 78 episode. Also, guys, Popular Cradle, we've been doing this for 2 years. Our first episode was a Nakba-related episode, May 2024. So it's been 2 years of Popular Cradle. Inshallah, many more. And we'll see you next time. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.